Section 6 of Bushido, The Soul of Japan, by Inatsu Nitobe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Self-control and the institutions of suicide and redress. They were an embodiment of what was considered as an end of all learning, and were thus a living example of that discipline of disciplines, self-control, which was universally required of samurai. The discipline of fortitude on the one hand, inculcating endurance without a groan, and the teaching of politeness on the other, requiring us not to mar the pleasure or serenity of another by manifestations of our own sorrow or pain, combined to engender a stoical turn of mind, and eventually to confirm it into a national trait of apparent stoicism. I say apparent stoicism because I do not believe that true stoicism can ever become the characteristic of a whole nation, and also because some of our national manners and customs may seem to a foreign observer hard-hearted. Yet we are really as susceptible to tender emotion as any race under the sky. I am inclined to think that in one sense we have to feel more than others, yes, doubly more, since the very attempt to restrain natural promptings entails suffering. Imagine boys, and girls too, brought up not to resort to the shedding of a tear or the uttering of a groan for the relief of their feelings. And there is a physiological problem whether such efforts steel their nerves or makes them more sensitive. It was considered unmanly for a samurai to betray his emotions on his face. Quote, "He shows no sign of joy or anger," end quote, was a phrase used in describing a strong character. The most natural affections were kept under control. A father could embrace his son only at the expense of his dignity. A husband would not kiss his wife, no, not in the presence of other people, whatever he might do in private. There may be some truth in the remark of a witty youth when he said, quote, "American husbands kiss their wives in public and beat them in private. Japanese husbands beat theirs in public and kiss them in private." End quote. Calmness of behavior, composure of mind, should not be disturbed by passion of any kind. I remember when, during the late war with China, a regiment left a certain town, a large concourse of people flocked to the station to bid farewell to the general and his army. On this occasion, an American resident resorted to the place, expecting to witness loud demonstrations, as the nation itself was highly excited, and there were fathers, mothers, and sweethearts of the soldiers in the crowd. The American was strangely disappointed, for as the whistle blew and the train began to move, the hats of thousands of people were silently taken off, and their heads bowed in reverential farewell. No waving of handkerchiefs, no word uttered, but deep silence in which only an attentive ear could catch a few broken sobs. In domestic life, too, I know of a father who spent whole nights listening to the breathing of a sick child, standing behind the door that he might not be caught in such an act of parental weakness. I know of a mother who, in her last moments, refrained from sending for her son, that he might not be disturbed in his studies. Our history and everyday life are replete with examples of heroic matrons, who can well bear comparison with some of the most touching pages of Plutarch. Among our peasantry, an Ian McLaren would be sure to find many a Margaret Howe. It is the same discipline of self-restraint which is accountable for the absence of more frequent revivals in the Christian churches of Japan. When a man or woman feels his or her soul stirred, the first instinct is to quietly suppress any indication of it. In rare instances is the tongue set free by an irresistible spirit, when we have eloquence of sincerity and fervor. It is putting a premium upon a breach of the third commandment to encourage speaking lightly of spiritual experience. It is truly jarring to Japanese ears to hear the most sacred words, the most secret heart experiences, thrown out in promiscuous audiences. Quote, "Dost thou feel the soil of thy soul stirred with tender thoughts? It is time for seeds to sprout. Disturb it not with speech, but let it work alone in quietness and secrecy," end quote, writes a young samurai in his diary. To give in so many articulate words one's inmost thoughts and feelings, notably the religious, is taken among us as an unmistakable sign that they are neither very profound nor very sincere. Quote, "Only a pomegranate is he," so runs a popular saying, "who when he gapes his mouth displays the contents of his heart." End quote. It is not altogether perverseness of Oriental minds that the instant our emotions are moved we try to guard our lips in order to hide them. Speech is very often with us, as the Frenchman defined it, quote, "the art of concealing thought," end quote. Call upon a Japanese friend in time of deepest affliction, and he will invariably receive you laughing, with red eyes or moist cheeks. At first you may think him hysterical. Press him for explanation, and you will get a few broken commonplaces. Quote, "Human life has sorrow," end quote. Quote, "They who meet must part," end quote. Quote, "He that is born must die," end quote. Quote, "It is foolish to count the years of a child that is gone, but a woman's heart will indulge in follies," end quote, and the like. So the noble words of a noble Hohenzollern, quote, "Lern zu leiden und klagen," end quote, had found many responsive minds among us long before they were uttered. Indeed, the Japanese have recourse to risibility whenever the frailties of human nature are put to severest test. I think we possess a better reason than Democritus himself for our Abderian tendency, for laughter with us oftenest veils an effort to regain balance of temper when disturbed by any untoward circumstance. It is a counterpoise of sorrow or rage. The suppression of feelings being thus steadily insisted upon, they find their safety valve in poetical aphorism. A poet of the 10th century writes, quote, "In Japan, and China as well, humanity when moved by sorrow tells its bitter grief in verse." End quote. A mother who tries to console her broken heart by fancying her departed child absent on his wonted chase after the dragonfly, hums, quote, "How far today in chase, I wonder, has gone my hunter of the dragonfly," end quote. I refrain from quoting other examples, for I know I could do only scant justice to the pearly gems of our literature, were I to render into a foreign tongue the thoughts which were wrung drop by drop from bleeding hearts and threaded into beads of rarest value. I hope I have, in a measure, shown that inner working of our minds, which often presents an appearance of callousness, or of a hysterical mixture of laughter and dejection, and whose sanity is sometimes called in question. It has also been suggested that our endurance of pain and indifference to death are due to less sensitive nerves. This is plausible as far as it goes. The next question is, why are our nerves less tightly strung? It may be our climate is not so stimulating as the American. It may be our monarchical form of government does not excite us as much as the Republic does the Frenchman. It may be that we do not read Sartor Resartus as zealously as the Englishman. Personally, I believe it was our very excitability and sensitiveness which made it a necessity to recognize and enforce constant self-repression. But whatever may be the explanation, without taking into account long years of discipline in self-control, none can be correct. Discipline in self-control can easily go too far. It can well repress the genial current of the soul. It can force pliant natures into distortions and monstrosities. It can beget bigotry, breed hypocrisy, or habitate affections. Be a virtue never so noble, it has its counterpart and counterfeit. We must recognize in each virtue its own positive excellence, and follow its positive ideal. And the ideal of self-restraint is to keep our mind level, as our expression is, or, to borrow a Greek term, attain the state of euthymia, which Democritus called the highest good. The acme of self-control is reached and best illustrated in the first of the two institutions which we shall now bring to view, namely, the institutions of suicide and redress, of which, the former known as harakiri, and the latter as kataki uchi, many foreign writers have treated more or less fully. To begin with suicide, let me state that I confine my observations only to seppuku or kappuku, popularly known as harakiri, which means self-immolation by disembowelment. Quote, "Ripping the abdomen? How absurd!" End quote. So cry those to whom the name is new. Absurdly odd as it may sound at first to foreign ears, it cannot be so very foreign to students of Shakespeare, who puts these words in Brutus's mouth. Quote, "Thy," Caesar's, "spirit walks abroad and turns our swords into our proper entrails." End quote. Listen to a modern English poet who, in his Light of Asia, speaks of a sword piercing the bowels of a queen. None blames him for bad English or breach of modesty. Or, to take still another example, look at Guercino's painting of Cato's death in the Palazzo Brassa in Genoa. Whoever has read the swan song, which Addison makes Cato sing, will not jeer at the sword half buried in his abdomen. In our minds, this mode of death is associated with instances of noblest deeds, and of most touching pathos, so that nothing repugnant, much less ludicrous, mars our conception of it. So wonderful is the transforming power of virtue, of greatness, of tenderness, that the vilest form of death assumes a sublimity, and becomes a symbol of new life, or else the sign which Constantine beheld would not conquer the world. Not for extraneous associations only does seppuku lose in our mind any taint of absurdity, for the choice of this particular part of the body to operate upon was based on an old anatomical belief as to the seat of the soul and of the affections. When Moses wrote of Joseph's, quote, "bowels yearning upon his brother," end quote, or David prayed the Lord not to forget his bowels, or when Isaiah, Jeremiah, and other inspired men of old spoke of the sounding or the troubling of bowels, they all and each endorsed the belief prevalent among the Japanese that in the abdomen was enshrined the soul. The Semites habitually spoke of the liver and kidneys and surrounding fat as the seat of emotion and life. The term hara was more comprehensive than the Greek phren or thumos, and the Japanese and Hellenese alike thought the spirit of man to dwell somewhere in that region. Such a notion is by no means confined to the peoples of antiquity. The French, in spite of the theory propounded by one of their most distinguished philosophers, Descartes, that the soul is located in the pineal gland, still insist in using the term ventre in a sense which, if anatomically too vague, is nevertheless physiologically significant. Similarly, entrailles stands in their language for affection and compassion. Nor is such belief mere superstition, being more scientific than the general idea of making the heart the center of the feelings. Without asking a friar, the Japanese knew better than Romeo, quote, in what vile part of this anatomy one's name did lodge." Modern neurologists speak of the abdominal and pelvic brains, denoting thereby sympathetic nerve centers in those parts which are strongly affected by any psychical action. This view of mental physiology once admitted, the syllogism of seppuku is easy to construct. "I will open the seat of my soul, and show you how it fares with it. See for yourself whether it is polluted or clean." I do not wish to be understood as asserting religious or even moral justification of suicide, but the high estimate placed upon honor was ample excuse with many for taking one's own life. How many acquiesced in the sentiment expressed by Garth? "When honor's lost, 'tis a relief to die. Death's but a sure retreat from infamy," and have smilingly surrendered their souls to oblivion. Death, when honor was involved, was accepted in Bushido as a key to the solution of many complex problems, so that to an ambitious samurai a natural departure from life seemed a rather tame affair, and a consummation not devoutly to be wished for. I dare say that many good Christians, if only they are honest enough, will confess the fascination of, if not positive admiration for, the sublime composure with which Cato, Brutus, Petronius, and a host of other ancient worthies terminated their own earthly existence. Is it too bold to hint that the death of the first of the philosophers was partly suicidal? When we are told so minutely by his pupils how their master willingly submitted to the mandate of the state, which he knew was morally mistaken, in spite of the possibilities of escape, and how he took up the cup of hemlock in his own hand, even offering libation from its deadly contents, do we not discern in his whole proceeding and demeanor an act of self-immolation? No physical compulsion here, as in ordinary cases of execution. True, the verdict of the judges was compulsory. It said, "Thou shalt die, and that by thy own hand." If suicide meant no more than dying by one's own hand, Socrates was a clear case of suicide. But nobody would charge him with the crime. Plato, who was averse to it, would not call his master a suicide. Now my readers will understand that seppuku was not a mere suicidal process. It was an institution, legal and ceremonial. An invention of the Middle Ages, it was a process by which warriors could expiate their crimes, apologize for errors, escape from disgrace, redeem their friends, or prove their sincerity. When enforced as a legal punishment, it was practiced with due ceremony. It was a refinement of self-destruction, and none could perform it without the utmost coolness of temper and composure of demeanor, and for these reasons it was particularly befitting the profession of bushi. Antiquarian curiosity, if nothing else, would tempt me to give here a description of this obsolete ceremonial, but seeing that such a description was made by a far abler writer, whose book is not much read nowadays, I am tempted to make a somewhat lengthy quotation. Mitford, in his Tales of Old Japan, after giving a translation of a treatise on seppuku from a rare Japanese manuscript, goes on to describe an instance of such an execution, of which he was an eyewitness. "We, 7 foreign representatives, were invited to follow the Japanese witness into the hondo, or main hall of the temple, where the ceremony was to be performed. It was an imposing scene. A large hall with a high roof, supported by dark pillars of wood. From the ceiling hung a profusion of those huge gilt lamps and ornaments peculiar to Buddhist temples. In front of the high altar, where the floor, covered with beautiful white mats, is raised some 3 or 4 inches from the ground, was laid a rug of scarlet felt. Tall candles, placed at regular intervals, gave out a dim, mysterious light, just sufficient to let all the proceedings be seen. The 7 Japanese took their places on the left of the raised floor, the 7 foreigners on the right. No other person was present. After the interval of a few minutes of anxious suspense, Taki Zenzaburo, a stalwart man 32 years of age, with a noble air, walked into the hall attired in his dress of ceremony, with the peculiar hempen cloth wings which are worn on great occasions. He was accompanied by a kaishaku and 3 officers, who wore the jimbayori, or war surcoat, with gold tissue facings. The word kaishaku, it should be observed, is one to which our word executioner is no equivalent term. The office is that of a gentleman. In many cases it is performed by a kinsman or friend of the condemned, and the relation between them is rather that of principal and second than that of victim and executioner. In this instance, the kaishaku was a pupil of Taki Zenzaburo, and was selected by friends of the latter from among their own number for his skill in swordsmanship. With the kaishaku on his left hand, Taki Zenzaburo advanced slowly towards the Japanese witnesses, and the 2 bowed before them. Then, drawing near to the foreigners, they saluted us in the same way, perhaps even with more deference. In each case the salutation was ceremoniously returned. Slowly and with great dignity the condemned man mounted on to the raised floor, prostrated himself before the high altar twice, and seated himself on the felt carpet with his back to the high altar, the kaishaku crouching on his left-hand side. Footnote: seated himself, that is, in the Japanese fashion, his knees and toes touching the ground, and his body resting on his heels. In this position, which is one of respect, he remained until his death. End footnote. One of the 3 attendant officers then came forward, bearing a stand of the kind used in the temple for offerings, on which, wrapped in paper, lay the wakizashi, the short sword or dirk of the Japanese, 9 inches and a half in length, with a point and an edge as sharp as a razor's. This he handed, prostrating himself, to the condemned man, who received it reverently, raising it to his head with both hands, and placed it in front of himself. After another profound obeisance, Taki Zenzaburo, in a voice which betrayed just so much emotion and hesitation as might be expected from a man who was making a painful confession, but with no sign of either in his face or manner, spoke as follows. Quote, I, and I alone, unwarrantably gave the order to fire on the foreigners at Kobe, and again as they tried to escape. For this crime I disembowel myself, and I beg you who are present to do me the honor of witnessing the act. End quote. Bowing once more, the speaker allowed his upper garments to slip down to his girdle, and remained naked to the waist. Carefully, according to custom, he tucked his sleeves under his knees to prevent himself from falling backward, for a noble Japanese gentleman should die falling forwards. Deliberately, with a steady hand, he took the dirk that lay before him. He looked at it wistfully, almost affectionately. For a moment he seemed to collect his thoughts for the last time, and then, stabbing himself deeply below the waist in the left-hand side, he drew the dirk slowly across to his right side, and turning it in the wound, gave a slight cut upwards. During this sickeningly painful operation, he never moved a muscle of his face. When he drew out the dirk, he leaned forward and stretched out his neck. An expression of pain for the first time crossed his face, but he uttered no sound. At that moment, the kaishaku, who, still crouching by his side, had been keenly watching his every movement, sprang to his feet, poised his sword for a second in the air. There was a flash, a heavy, ugly thud, a crashing fall. With one blow, the head had been severed from the body. A dead silence followed, broken only by the hideous noise of the blood throbbing out of the inert head before us, which, but a moment before, had been a brave and chivalrous man. It was horrible. The kaishaku made a low bow, wiped his sword with a piece of paper which he had ready for the purpose, and retired from the raised floor, and the stained dirk was solemnly borne away, a bloody proof of the execution. The two representatives of the Mikado then left their places, and crossing over to where the foreign witnesses sat, called to us to witness that the sentence of death upon Taki Zenzaburo had been faithfully carried out. The ceremony being at an end, we left the temple." End quote. I might multiply any number of descriptions of seppuku from literature or from the relation of eyewitnesses, but one more instance will suffice. Two brothers, Sakon and Naiki, respectively 24 and 17 years of age, made an effort to kill Ieyasu in order to avenge their father's wrongs. But before they could enter the camp, they were made prisoners. The old general admired the pluck of the youths who dared an attempt on his life, and ordered that they should be allowed to die an honorable death. Their little brother, Hachimaro, a mere infant of 8 summers, was condemned to a similar fate, as the sentence was pronounced on all the male members of the family, and the 3 were taken to a monastery where it was to be executed. A physician who was present on the occasion has left us a diary from which the following scene is translated. Quote, "When they were all seated in a row for final dispatch, Sakon turned to the youngest and said, quote, 'Go thou first, for I wish to be sure that thou dost it aright.' End quote. Upon the little one's replying that, as he had never seen seppuku performed, he would like to see his brothers do it, and then he could follow them, the older brothers smiled between their tears. Quote, 'Well said, little fellow, so canst thou well boast of being our father's child.' End quote. When they had placed him between them, Sakon thrust the dagger into the left side of his own abdomen and asked, quote, 'Look, brother, dost understand now? Only don't push the dagger too far, lest thou fall back. Lean forward, rather, and keep thy knees well composed.' End quote. Naiki did likewise, and said to the boy, quote, 'Keep thy eyes open, or else thou mayest look like a dying woman. If thy dagger feels anything within and thy strength fails, take courage and double thy effort to cut across.' End quote. The child looked from one to the other, and when both had expired, he calmly half denuded himself, and followed the example set him on either hand." End quote. The glorification of seppuku offered, naturally enough, no small temptation to its unwarranted committal. For causes entirely incompatible with reason, or for reasons entirely undeserving of death, hot-headed youths rushed into it as insects fly into fire. Mixed and dubious motives drove more samurai to this deed than nuns into convent gates. Life was cheap as reckoned by the popular standard of honor. The saddest feature was that honor, which was always in the agio, so to speak, was not always solid gold, but alloyed with baser metals. No one circle in the Inferno will boast of greater density of Japanese population than the 7th, to which Dante consigns all victims of self-destruction. And yet, for a true samurai to hasten death or to court it was alike cowardice. A typical fighter, when he lost battle after battle and was pursued from plain to hill and from bush to cavern, found himself hungry and alone in the dark hollow of a tree, his sword blunt with use, his bow broken, and arrows exhausted. Did not the noblest of the Romans fall upon his own sword in Philippi under like circumstances? Deemed it cowardly to die but with a fortitude approaching a Christian martyr's, cheered himself with an impromptu verse. Quote, "Come, evermore, come, ye dread sorrows and pains, and heap on my burdened back, that I not one test may lack of what strength in me remains." End quote. This, then, was the Bushido teaching. Bear and face all calamities and adversities with patience and a pure conscience. For as Mencius taught, footnote, I used Dr. Leggie's translation verbatim, end footnote, quote, "When heaven is about to confer a great office on anyone, it first exercises his mind with suffering and his sinews and bones with toil. It exposes his body to hunger and subjects him to extreme poverty, and it confounds his undertakings. In all these ways it stimulates his mind, hardens his nature, and supplies his incompetencies." End quote. True honor lies in fulfilling heaven's decree, and no death incurred in so doing is ignominious, whereas death to avoid what heaven has in store is cowardly indeed. In that quaint book of Sir Thomas Browne's, Reglio Medici, there is an exact English equivalent for what is repeatedly taught in our precepts. Let me quote it. Quote, "It is a brave act of valor to condemn death, but where life is more terrible than death, it is then the truest valor to dare to live." End quote. A renowned priest of the 17th century satirically observed, quote, "Talk as he may, a samurai who never has died is apt in decisive moments to flee or hide." End quote. Again, quote, "Him who once has died in the bottom of his breast, no spears of Sanada nor all the arrows of Tometomo can pierce." End quote. How near we come to the portals of the temple whose builder taught, quote, "He that loseth his life for my sake shall find it." End quote. These are but a few of the numerous examples which tend to confirm the moral identity of the human species, notwithstanding an attempt so assiduously made to render the distinction between Christian and pagan as great as possible. We have thus seen that the Bushido institution of suicide was neither so irrational nor barbarous as its abuse strikes us at first sight. We will now see whether its sister institution of redress, or call it revenge if you will, has its mitigating features. I hope I can dispose of this question in a few words, since a similar institution, or call it custom, if that suits you better, has at some time prevailed among all peoples and has not yet become entirely obsolete, as attested by the continuance of dueling and lynching. Why, has not an American captain recently challenged Esterhazy that the wrongs of Dreyfus be avenged? Among a savage tribe which has no marriage, adultery is not a sin, and only the jealousy of a lover protects a woman from abuse. So in a time which has no criminal court, murder is not a crime, and only the vigilant vengeance of the victim's people preserves social order. Quote, "What is the most beautiful thing on earth?" End quote, said Osiris to Horus. The reply was, quote, "To avenge a parent's wrongs," end quote, to which a Japanese would have added, quote, "and a master's," end quote. In revenge there is something which satisfies one's sense of justice. The avenger reasons, quote, "My good father did not deserve death. He who killed him did great evil. My father, if he were alive, would not tolerate a deed like this. Heaven itself hates wrongdoing. It is the will of my father, it is the will of heaven, that the evildoer cease from his work. He must perish by my hand, because he shed my father's blood. I, who am his flesh and blood, must shed the murderer's. The same heaven shall not shelter him and me." End quote. The ratiocination is simple and childish, though we know Hamlet did not reason much more deeply, nevertheless it shows an innate sense of exact balance and equal justice. Quote, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." End quote. Our sense of revenge is as exact as our mathematical faculty, and until both terms of the equation are satisfied, we cannot get over the sense of something left undone. In Judaism, which believed in a jealous God, or in Greek mythology, which provided a nemesis, vengeance may be left to superhuman agencies, but common sense furnished Bushido with the institution of redress as a kind of ethical court of equity, where people could take cases not to be judged in accordance with ordinary law. The master of the 47 Ronins was condemned to death. He had no court of higher instance to appeal to. His faithful retainers addressed themselves to vengeance, the only supreme court existing. They, in their turn, were condemned by common law, but the popular instinct passed a different judgment, and hence their memory is still kept as green and fragrant, as are their graves at Sengakuji to this day. Though Lao Tse taught to recompense injury with kindness, the voice of Confucius was very much louder, which counseled that injury must be recompensed with justice, and yet revenge was justified only when it was undertaken in behalf of our superiors and benefactors. One's own wrongs, including injuries done to wife and children, were to be borne and forgiven. A samurai could therefore fully sympathize with Hannibal's oath to avenge his country's wrongs, but he scorns James Hamilton for wearing in his girdle a handful of earth from his wife's grave, as an eternal incentive to avenge her wrongs on the Regent Murray. Both of these institutions of suicide and redress lost their raison d'être at the promulgation of the criminal code. No more do we hear of romantic adventures of a fair maiden as she tracks in disguise the murderer of her parent. No more can we witness tragedies of family vendetta enacted. The knight-errantry of Miyamoto Musashi is now a tale of the past. The well-ordered police spies out the criminal for the injured party, and the law metes out justice. The whole state and society will see that wrong is righted. The sense of justice satisfied, there is no need of kataki uchi. If this had meant that, quote, hunger of the heart which feeds upon the hope of glutting that hunger with the life-blood of the victim, end quote, as a New England divine has described it, a few paragraphs in the criminal code would not so entirely have made an end of it. As to seppuku, though it too has no existence du jour, we still hear of it from time to time, and shall continue to hear, I am afraid, as long as the past is remembered. Many painless and time-saving methods of self-immolation will come in vogue, as its votaries are increasing with fearful rapidity throughout the world. But Professor Morselli will have to concede to seppuku an aristocratic position among them. He maintains that, quote, when suicide is accomplished by very painful means, or at the cost of prolonged agony, in 99 cases out of 100, it may be assigned as the act of a mind disordered by fanaticism, by madness, or by morbid excitement. End quote. Footnote. Morselli, Suicide, page 314. End footnote. But a normal seppuku does not savor of fanaticism, or madness, or excitement, utmost sang-froid being necessary to its successful accomplishment. Of the two kinds into which Dr. Strahan, footnote, suicide and insanity, end footnote, divides suicide, the rational, or quasi, and the irrational, or true, seppuku is the best example of the former type. From these bloody institutions, as well as from the general tenor of Bushido, it is easy to infer that the sword played an important part in social discipline and life. End of section 6.